which is being co-organized between the United Nations Academic Impact and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of course, marking Human Rights Day, but also, as all of you know, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is one of the landmarks of the work of our organization. And of course, in these challenging, complicated, complex times, it seems more relevant and more pertinent than ever before to talk about human rights and to talk about not only the standards concerning international human rights law, but also where we are with the implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and more importantly, for the work that we do in the UN Academic Impact, how critical institutions of higher education are, not only to teach, research, but also engage with the communities, the private sector, and all the stakeholders. And we appreciate also, of course, the work of the Office of the High Commissioner, both here in New York and in Geneva, who work tirelessly also with the intergovernmental bodies, the Human Rights Council, and many other bodies over there to make human rights more than a theory, a reality for all of us, and particularly for those who are suffering the most around the world. And with that, I will now give the floor for welcoming remarks, first to Ilse Brands-Keris, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. You have the floor, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Omar, and happy to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Maher. Very good to see you. I know many of you are online, so dear professors, postdocs, students, researchers, it's really a great pleasure to be here for this very important topic as we are approaching, of course, very fast, finally, 10th of December, the big day that we were looking forward to all this year with the anniversary. But of course, here in particular, the great initiative that really the UN Academic Impact is, it's always very important to make those bridges between what we do in institutions and what you do academically, and of course reaching out into society and how we really make that big change happen. So you are over 1,600 institutions from more than 150 countries, and you reach more than 25 million people. That's huge. It's very impressive. And of course, the fields of education and research, as you mentioned, but of course your reach goes beyond that. So clearly, this is truly a global network. I'm very happy to see that inspiration from you. You have in the multidisciplinary approach, including to human rights, in the multicultural, multilinguistic, and multi-diverse in so many other ways as well. I think that's really an incredible resource that you are. And of course, then coming together for whatever it is the academic purposes, but also to advocate, support, and strengthen both the values and the goals, and of course going through all three UN pillars, as you know, peace and security, development, and today's topic, the one pillar, human rights, of course, that we are now concerned with here. So it's in the spirit of the anniversary that I guess it also is something we hope to use as a momentum, all of us together, and for you as well, I hope, to inspire us. The declaration itself is a truly inspiring text. I think we can still confirm. I hope you're with me on that one. We know it's the most translated text in the world with more than 500 languages. I thought that was very impressive as well. But it came, of course, out of the horrors and the traumas of the World War, but also really managed to express those dreams and hopes, truly aspirations that came through all of those very intense and very passionate debates that were held at the time, of course, when the United Nations was still very, very young around here. So we know, we always stress that the rights are, of course, universal, and that's the key point, and indivisible and interlinked as well. So we look at all the rights, and obviously the fundamental, that recognizing really the equal worth of every single human being. So there we know that that's the aspiration, but sadly we also know that and every day we are reminded how far we are from actually making that into the reality for all everywhere. The conflicts go on. We have seen very recently very sad examples, and I know many of you have been in environments where you've seen this very directly in the rise in hate speech. and also the spread of hate speech, more intense hate speech. Inequalities have continued over the years to only deepen. And of course, the new challenges that we keep talking about, those related to new technologies. And we have, of course, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution altogether. And many other challenges that we haven't maybe even started to talk about properly, but clearly in that innovative environment that you are part of, that's exactly where you can push the agenda ahead as well. Anniversaries, our High Commissioner has said, are arbitrary unless we seize them as meaningful opportunities to reflect on our own achievements, to learn from our mistakes, and to take fearless steps towards progress and transformation. And I thought that was really beautifully said, so I wanted to make sure we included that. So that's, of course, the whole point of being here, for all of you to come together and for us to be together on this 75th anniversary, to really discuss how universities or research institutions, and indeed these kinds of multifaceted higher education networks, as the academic impact, can help to transform those aspirations into tools that can be used to really achieve the goals of the declaration itself, how to be effective. And particularly as we see when there is a continuously evolving context of challenges around us, but also we need to evolve in our understanding of how we can then apply human rights and how to make it better. So that, of course, will have an impact on how human rights, your work, on how human rights are studied, how human rights are taught, very important part of it, but also the research. And I always stress the importance of both the qualitative and quantitative methods in that research, the full picture of research, to gather the evidence that we need to be able to address situations and compare situations, analyze them, exploring the whole correlations and causalities between how we really work and to make our work better on human rights as practitioners as well, and obviously developing theory also. So all of that in order to inform how our institutions in society are made, how the legislative frameworks are, the particular laws, how policies are developed, and to advise really both government, civil society, and also the United Nations, for which we're very grateful. So that's something where, and of course, I'm very happy, Omar, that you mentioned at first, of course, the stakeholder thing, the outreach in society, the large reach that you have to other stakeholders. So it really is an all society interaction on it with your own advocacy, with your constituents, but essentially in all of the work that you do on a daily basis. So I'm very happy that we are all gathered here. I look forward to the great discussion that will follow in 2 panels, and I thank you for listening to me.
I thank the distinguished United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights for her remarks and for her being here despite her very hectic schedule of missions around the world. So I appreciate that. And now I give the floor to Maher Nasser, who is the Director of the Outreach Division in the United Nations Department of Global Communications.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Ilse, for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you here with us and to mark, in 10 days, we will mark it officially on the 10th of December, but Omar started by saying, ladies and gentlemen. I was looking around the room. Very few gentlemen are in here, which is a good sign. I've been to academic conferences with the UN Academic Impact in other parts of the world, and it would be very difficult to find a woman in the room, especially in the Far East. It's mainly, especially if you talk about leadership of universities and academic institutions. So it's good to see that reversed, and I think this is one of the things why the number 5 of the Sustainable Development Goals is gender equality. That said, when Eleanor Roosevelt was assigned to the 3rd committee, I think one of the reflections in a past observance of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, somebody was enacting her role at the time, and she was saying, she wanted to be involved with this new organization. She was the First Lady of the United States, and she was eager to play a role. And she was told, reiterating what was going on in the men's mind, I will send the women to the 3rd committee. So they sent her to the 3rd committee so that, She won't be dealing with the peace and security, economic, finance. That's social issues. That's where they made the mistake, but it was a gain for us. It wasn't just her. There were other women who played a key role in the formulation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as we see it today. One of the, maybe symbolic, but one of the first drafts said, all men are born equal. And it wasn't a man who caught, wait a minute, it's not all men, it should be all human. If there weren't women in the room, we would have been stuck with a document that only talks about half of society. So I think when we talk about these things, when we talk about why are human rights one of the core principles on the pillars of the organization. Something else, Omar mentioned principles. A quote that I had it in the whiteboard in my office, but then it's ingrained in my mind, is something that Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali said 30 years ago, a little bit more than 30 years ago when he started. You mentioned in these turbulent times. The quote goes, in these turbulent times, there's only one power that can impose order on incipient chaos. It is the power of principles transcending changing perceptions of expediency. Just think about it for a minute. That 30 years ago, first of all, he was saying, in these turbulent times. I bet you can take any moment in history, you'll find a leader saying, in these turbulent times, in these unprecedented times. Everybody thinks that the time they're living in is the time when it is turbulent, when it is unprecedented. And humanity and humans, we keep surprising ourselves by putting ourselves in moments that are actually even more turbulent and more damaging. We live in a time when we have a triple planetary crisis. We had rising numbers of conflicts. We have the largest number of displaced people internally and refugees. We have the largest number of increase in poverty since 2019. For the first time, number of people living in extreme poverty has actually increased since 1990. For the first time, the number of people who are food insecure is increasing. For the first time, and we heard warning this morning from our colleagues in the World Food Programme that they're looking at a potential famine situation in Gaza. And these are things that are challenging us. And why are they happening? Because we are ignoring the principles. When we talk about the principles need to be respected and worked and acted on. And that's where the role of universities and academia comes. Your role is to think about what and how can we challenge these things in a way that ensures that we are acting for the principles. 12, 13 years ago, in the department, we were looking at the work and role of the Global Compact, which was the first time that the United Nations in the year 2000 engaged with the private sector in an official capacity, which is tapping into the corporate social responsibility of the private sector. You want to be good? You want to do something good? Come and talk to the UN. There are these key principles, and let's work together, and so that you can actually be part of the solution, not part of the problem. In 2010, and recognizing the role of education and universities, we came up with the idea of tapping into the intellectual social responsibility of universities. And that was the birth of the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative. That universities, places of learning, have, again, a responsibility because they are preparing leaders of the future. They're also leading with the research and intellectual discussions that are challenging the givens. And the givens are never always givens all the time. They need to be challenged. But what does not need to be challenged are the principles. And the principles laid out in the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are that. That's why it is translated to 500 languages. That's why the Charter of the United Nations was amended once in the early 60s to increase the number of Security Council members from 12 to 15. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and some say it needs another amendment because it is not representative, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has not been changed or amended because I think we can all agree that we are all human, we need to all be respected on the basis of who we are, no matter where we are born, and that human rights are universals. Universality of those principles is one of the successes of the organization, I would say, in the last 75 years. And I agree with High Commissioner Volker that anniversaries are not a time to light candles and celebrate. They are actually opportunities for reflection. And that's what happened in the year 2020. We were marking the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And Secretary General Antonio Guterres told us, this is not about looking back and saying we've done this, we've achieved that. Let us organize a listening exercise. Let us engage in a global dialogue to think about beyond 2030, to think about what does the world needs to look like in the year 2045, in the year 2050. And that dialogue started at the beginning of 2020, and then what happened? COVID-19. So instead of having in-person dialogues, we had virtual dialogues, and came up, much of what we learned, we shared with member states. They asked the Secretary General to come up with a proposal. He came up with a report called Our Common Agenda, which spoke about a direction. There are 11 policy papers, and I think in every university really needs to look at those that really set the direction of where the UN thinks we need to start tinkering with, looking at things, and 4 summits. One of them is coming up next year, the Summit of the Future. And the Summit of the Future will take place here, 22nd, 23rd September, and the member states have agreed there will be 5 chapters. They will be looking at sustainable development and financing for development, peace and security, youth and future generations, science, technology, innovation, AI, whatever you want, and global governance. And cross-cutting, gender and human rights. So human rights is everywhere, because without that pillar, peace and security is not going to be possible. Without peace and security, sustainable development is not going to be possible. When we look at conflict situations, we see how they impact development. We see that a conflict that can affect the price of food, that can affect the price of energy, has ramifications and implications all over the world. So this is why human rights are really at the core of what we do. And I look forward to listening to all of the discussions. Thank you.
I thank the director.
Sorry, Ahmad, for not reading your statement.
Thank you very much indeed to Maher, the director of the Outreach Division of the UN Department of Global Communication, for his remarks. And now we turn to the 2 panels that we're going to have today. Just a little bit of explanation. After hearing the presentations from each one of the speakers, we will have a brief time for Q&A. And we have 11 speakers in total. So I ask you to kindly keep your remarks to 5 minutes or 6 tops, so we can have enough time for discussion. And those 11 speakers come from 11 different universities. So we are very pleased to have them here. Of course, our public here, who also comes, for the most part, from university, but also from civil society and other organizations. And of course, to those of you who are watching online, this is being broadcast live through UN Web TV around the world. With that, allow me to introduce the first 4 speakers of the first panel, which is titled The Universal Declaration at 75, from the perspective of universities, how the declaration still resonates today in face of the new global challenges. And we have for that, first of all, Jackie Dugard. She's a senior lecturer at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University and visiting professor in the School of Law at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. She works for the project Pluriland about the impact of human security on enacting plural land rights, co-edited the Research Handbook on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and Human Rights, and co-founded the Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa. We also have next to her Penny Venetis. She's the director of the International Human Rights Clinic and distinguished clinical professor of law at Rutgers University, expert in international human rights law, pioneering efforts to integrate international law into U.S. law. She was the executive vice president and legal director of Legal Momentum and worked for the UN Special Rapporteur investigating war crimes in the former Yugoslavia, focused on the use of rape as a war crime. Next to her, we have Susan Ken, associate professor of political science at the George Jane College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. Her research and teaching interests include international relations, labor and human rights, and international law. She authored Human Rights and Labor Solidarity and co-edited Human Rights, Institutions and Practices. She is also the editor of Global Constitutionalism. And last but not least, we have Zoe Burkholder, Professor of Educational Foundations and founding director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Project in the College of Education at Montclair State University. She's an historian of education with expertise in anti-racist education, school integration, the social construction of race in schools, and educational activism among Black, Native American, Latinx, and Asian American communities. I welcome you all, and I now give the floor to Jackie Dugard. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. I would like to kick off by just echoing many of the comments about the unitary vision of the UDHR and how important that has been in my sphere of influence, whether it was in South Africa or here in the US. And I think what is so important about that is this understanding that it is essentially bad politics is born out of bad social and material conditions. So you need to address both the social conditions and the political and economic conditions. So for me, what I find most celebratory about the UDHR is what I call the everyone, everywhere, everything approach. So everyone, inherent humanity, regardless of your status, everywhere, so regardless also of geography or culture, etc. And then everything, and this is what I will focus on mostly because I come from a socioeconomic rights perspective. And for me, what is particularly inspiring about the UDHR is the everything approach, that it incorporates socioeconomic rights and cultural rights alongside civil and political rights. And this is something coming from a South African perspective that I can say from the Global South has been absolutely essential. I found it quite strange coming now to the US where socioeconomic rights are not as recognized. I would say that without a doubt in South Africa, they are the most recognized and most important rights. And I think that this making this unitary system, which of course we understand was unfortunately fractured during the Cold War, resulting in two covenants. But, you know, fortunately, as Louise Arbour had said in 2008, with the coming into force, or at least the green lighting of the optional protocol on ICESCA, that finally human rights could be made whole again. So that was obviously the journey started by the UDHR. And then quickly just to turn to today's challenges and why I think the UDHR remains relevant. One of the key aspects of the UDHR, obviously Article 1 on equality, is slightly different to the way that is phrased, I think, in many other systems, including domestic systems, the focus on equality rather than non-discrimination. And one of the challenges I see in the world today is rising socioeconomic inequality. So I find this principle of equality in an increasingly financial capitalist system, which is racialized and gendered and resulting in essentially benefits only for 1% of the world. I think the focus on equality is something that we should always be turning to, and it's something that I teach a lot in my class, whether inequality is a human rights violation beyond poverty. And then, of course, it has to be said that there is nothing in the UDHR on the ecology, the environment, or climate change per se, but I want to controversially put out that perhaps we can link that to equality. So I think that if we start to look at equality in a way of sanctioning redistribution, first and foremost, and possibly degrowth in the sense of lowering consumption amongst northern states and high consumers. And I think that that could possibly be linked to, this is really provocative, to Article 24 on rest and leisure, which has never been really taken up in the human rights machinery since, but I think that we could perhaps learn a lot about the need not to constantly think about growth. And more consumption, and think about the importance of rest and leisure and equality. And then I will finally say that I think as a rule of law basis and document, I think, and linked also to the equality principle, is the extremely important principle of every life having the same value, whether you are Ukrainian or Palestinian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Penny Benitez, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Penny Benitez. I'm a law professor at Rutgers Law School and the director of the International Human Rights Clinic. My work incorporates human rights law into U.S. law. I advocate for courts to apply human rights principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its progeny treaties when interpreting the U.S. Constitution. And that is because international human rights law is much more protective and positive and respectful of basic human rights than the U.S. Constitution. I know that this is a panel on higher education and human rights, but my talk will focus more broadly on all of education because I believe that it's really critical to talk about human rights to even preschoolers. So as the Assistant Secretary General just stated, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN itself were like phoenixes rising out of the ashes of World War II, where science and cutting-edge technologies were used to commit unthinkable atrocities, and where bombs that could wipe out our entire human race were dropped not once, but twice, on an island nation that had itself committed unthinkable atrocities in World War II. Somehow, in 1948, 75 years ago, against all odds, the UN devised a set of principles to usher in a new era of peace. An era where rather than dropping bombs on each other, the world's countries, including former mortal enemies, could agree on a set of ground rules so that the atrocities and destructions of World War II and all other wars before it would never be repeated. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights lists fundamental human rights in 30 simple principles that boil down to this: every person matters. And as was mentioned, it was truly revolutionary that the gender-neutral term person is used. All people are the same and apply to each one of us and to all of us at the same time. All people are equal. Every person has a right to their own beliefs and thoughts. Every person can marry who they want and have a family, own land, vote, work, and have access to the legal system. Everyone is entitled to leisure time, when one does not have to work, when one can enjoy being alive, and when one's soul can recharge. These principles are incredibly powerful and at the same time very simple. They're so simple that even a 3-year-old can understand them. And that was the point of the drafters. Everyone should be able to understand these principles regardless of who they are and what their education level is. And I turn now to education. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes clear that education and human rights go hand in hand. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration says that, quote, everyone has the right to an education, and that education should strengthen the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, that education shall promote tolerance and friendship, regardless of religion, race, or nationality. So Article 26, in essence, embodies all of the Declaration's other articles. Through education, we learn to tolerate, we make friends with different people, we respect those who are different from us as humans, regardless of their race, religion, identity, or opinions. And that is why dictatorships and fundamentalist groups do everything they can to limit education, so that people do not share ideas, so that people can be suspicious of one another, so that people can hate, so that people can be controlled, so that people can be punished without being able to defend themselves. Girls are always the first casualties of this. An educated girl who can think for herself and make friends on her own is harder to subjugate. She is dangerous. In many countries around the world, girls are not permitted to go to school. We all know about the Nobel laureate Malala, who was shot in the head by the Taliban for wanting to go to school. But not too many of us know that today 127 million girls who should go to school cannot and do not. Girls do not go to school because of poverty, child marriage, and violence. They do not go to school because they menstruate and menstrual products are not available to them, and there's shame around menstruation. And girls are kidnapped, raped, and killed on their way to and from school. Lack of access to education is not limited to girls. There are 132 million boys who should go to school who do not attend school because they have to work. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the UN reported that forced labor traffic among boys, so forced labor among boys, increased fivefold. These little boys perform the most dangerous tasks and are expendable. They die and are replaced by other expendable boys who engage in dangerous work and die, and the cycle of forced labor and death continues. So the world, in short, is not meeting its obligations under the Universal Declaration to educate, to create thinking, open-minded, curious people who would embrace the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration. We need to do better. We need to make education a key priority. But we need to make the type of education envisioned by the Universal Declaration our priority. That is because even in countries that actually do provide free public education, which is required by the Universal Declaration, the Universal Declaration's principles are not being adhered to. Books are being banned in record numbers around the world. Books are being burned, like at party bonfires. Children and their parents are not permitted to acknowledge their sexuality or gender identities. And school curricula cannot discuss issues of gender identity that would make children feel more comfortable and better able to learn. Students at university campuses around the world are at verbal warfare with one another. I don't use the term warfare lightly. Students are not engaging in debate or speaking to one another. They are yelling at each other and not hearing at each other. They are vilifying each other rather than working together to try and find solutions to the real problems that we have in this world. Protesters enter classrooms to disrupt studies and silence faculty members. Peaceful protests are interrupted by people who spew hate, and protests are being canceled by universities. How do we solve this big mess? The answer can be found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself. Article 26 does not stand alone. I really have always seen Article 26 as a sister of Articles 18 through 20. Article 18 guarantees freedom of thought. That means that it is a human right to disagree with someone or to believe something that nobody else believes in. Article 19 guarantees freedom of opinion and expression, and that means that people have an inalienable right to say things that other people might find uncomfortable. And Article 20 guarantees freedom of association. It also says that no one can be compelled to belong to an association that they do not wish to be a part of. Education, the Declaration's drafters believed, goes hand in hand with freedom of thought and tolerance. The opposite is true as well. Without education, people are narrow-minded and less likely to accept others and the viewpoint of others. Article 26 and Articles 18 through 20 should become our global mission. We must educate everyone and teach tolerance in school. Tolerance, though, does not mean silence. We can teach tolerance while also fulfilling all of the other articles of the Universal Declaration. Indeed, we have an obligation under the Declaration to identify and condemn abuses and all human rights violations. We do this by reporting and believing facts, by changing minds and official policies through the honest exchange of information and ideas, by not fudging data and ignoring real atrocities. That can only happen if we respect one another, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights tells us to do. We cannot condone violence against people who disagree with us. Because if that happens and our educational institution becomes a mechanism of monolithic thinking, intolerance, and hatred of others, we will go down the same path of destruction that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was designed to eliminate.
Thank you very much indeed. I now give the floor to Susan Kim. You have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the university and the Universal Declaration as having this sort of symbiotic relationship. So I've been teaching human rights to undergraduates and graduate students for about 15 years now. And one of the first exercises I do is I ask students, like, look at the whole Universal Declaration, like what's surprising. And I'm also a scholar of economic and social rights, and one of the things that's always very striking, right, is like the right to paid holidays. Like we're supposed to have dignity at work. We have a right to housing and healthcare, because here in the U.S. and not just in the U.S., right, the idea of rights has become decimated such that they're purely individual. They operate procedurally. People even argue that rights are kind of something that can be exchanged, right, in an instrumental manner. And so for me, the Universal Declaration and universities and higher education, they go hand in hand, because I sort of take as my understanding of human rights from Belden Field, who wrote a book called Rethinking Human Rights for the New Millennium, which is that human rights are the necessary preconditions for our full human potentiality and development, right? So in addition to all the things like equality, just a very basic understanding is that we all have a right to be like the best version of ourselves, like no matter who we are, who our parents are, what our belief systems are. And universities are a part of that process. And for me right now, universities are politically under attack by many forces. I teach and was completely educated at public universities. And public universities are revolutionary in that they're the idea that higher education is not a private good that people get by exchanging money, but rather it's a public responsibility, and that everyone benefits when the public treasury is used to educate people, and no matter who you are, no matter what your occupational outcomes may be, and that this is part of our right to flourishing. I mean, there's no right to university education in the Universal Declaration, but I would argue that it's part of the enabling process. So here in the U.S., there's this movement to think of universities as like places. I think the right uses a language of cultural Marxism, as if there's some kind of immediate transmission belt of values that come from professors who are supposedly all left-wing radicals, and they are not, to students. And the joke among professors is that we can't always get our students to do the assignments, so why would we get them to just automatically take on our values? It simply does not happen. Universities are places where students are taught to think for themselves, think about their values and what they want to do, independent of their families and their most intimate communities, which is very terrifying, I know. I'm also a parent, but is a revolutionary and like liberatory act for students, like young people, to think about themselves as future citizens, as future actors, as human rights. And so in my mind, as someone who's active in faculty unions, have been active in the union movement since I was in my early 20s, right, and study labor rights as human rights in my own research, protecting universities, protecting like the academic freedom of faculty members, protecting the freedoms of expression of students, right, is a fundamental way in which we in the higher education community can be activists, enablers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And universities have long been laboratories where young people have expanded on and demanded human rights, whether in university settings, right? For example, the student-led demands for ethnic studies and racial justice in universities, or in more global and solidaristic ways, such as the divestment campaign around South African apartheid and the 1990s, 2000s students for, again, sweatshops, right? So we see that students use universities as their laboratories for becoming active citizens. And also universities are closely tied with support for democracies, which is a whole nother thing we can talk about. But the liberal established democracies, this is something that political scientists are like scratching their heads about and that we all should be concerned about. The survey data suggests that many people, especially young people, are not so in love with the performance of our democratic institutions. Not that they're against democratic values and rights, but rather that they look at these problems that are entrenched: climate change, massive inequality, a lack of secure housing, healthcare access, cost of living crises all across like the established, developed West. And they're just saying, these institutions are not working out to meet our needs. And so universities can be places, I'm not saying that we have the answers, they can be places in which we work with the ideas and values of young people to figure out ways to deal with these political problems. So political scientists, Paul Pearson and I forget the other guy, they wrote a book about how American political institutions, they don't meet the needs of regular Americans, but rather the interests, sorry, my brain is focused on New York, but rather American political institutions magnify and address the needs of the already wealthy, the already powerful, and corporate. Sorry, Jacob Hacker was another professor's name. And so we have a duty, right? It's a deeply political duty, in my opinion, in the higher education community to protect higher education, to fight against inequality, to take the interests and the values of young people seriously and guide how we act as human rights scholars, practitioners, educators, and participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but not least, Zoe Burkhalder, you have the floor.
Great, thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here, and I wanted to say thank you, Mr. Hernandez, for having us, and to the panelists, and for all of you for joining us. The question we've been asked to address is this kind of complicated one. Is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights still relevant today, and how can universities, particularly, really help advance the goals represented by this Declaration of Human Rights? And so I'd like to answer that question from my perspective. I'm a historian of education and a scholar of education, and I'm also the founding director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Education Project. So from the perspective of my scholarship, I've actually investigated the different ways that Americans have taught about tolerance and justice, and particularly anti-racist education, initiative that goes back, not surprisingly, to the World War II era in an effort to combat many of the ideas put forth by the Nazi regime, many of which were widely, more or less, accepted by the American public. And so first, scientists and anthropologists working in a lot of the universities here in New York City and in the United States became very concerned with this problem of racial prejudice. And when they sat down and they really thought about it, and they said, okay, we're experts in prejudice, we're experts in racism, how do we persuade Americans not to kind of believe some of these ideas that are being popularized by the Nazis at this time? And their answer was essentially education, right? Like, we have to teach people, we have to teach Americans not to believe this stuff. We have to teach them the truth about racial equality and human equality and dignity. And to do so, they decided to target K through 12 schools for a couple of specific reasons. Number one, very broad reach, right? You're actually reaching millions and millions of people across the country very quickly and effectively. And number two, there was a broad understanding among psychologists in particular that young people were much more flexible in their views about race and ethnicity and religion and prejudice, and that you would actually be more effective reaching out and kind of basically educating or re-educating Americans by focusing on the youngest ones. And so we have this long history of tolerance education or anti-racist education in the United States. Much of it is coming out of scholarship and work that's being done in universities and then pushed down and pushed out through K through 12 schools and teachers through specific channels and pathways, including teacher education programs. We know from a historical perspective that these programs work. They not only help to reduce prejudice, but they also help to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment for all students. So in other words, let's say you have a school where there's a spark or an uptick in anti-Semitism, and the teachers and the administrators in that school are going to do some work to try to address that issue and to help promote ideas of tolerance for everyone, help to explain to the students and run them through some lessons and some content to help reduce anti-Semitism. We know that one of the results of that work is that you actually create a more inclusive environment for all the students in the school. It reduces prejudice across the board, and it helps everybody have more open communication, more open discussions, and even helps to improve the curriculum, helps to develop support for lessons on, say, Black history or women's history or Asian American and Pacific Islander history. So we know this stuff works, and yet we don't have a successful example. We don't have really strong and effective programs of tolerance or anti-racist education in the United States, and what's more, it's currently become this political kind of touch point, right? So now we have this odd situation in the United States where many of our states, including New Jersey and New York, have laws that support and even mandate and require education in K through 12 schools on the genocides of the world, on the Holocaust, even on things like LGBTQ history and contributions. And then we have states that have don't say gay laws, that have banned books on African American history and canceled courses in African American history where it's dangerous for teachers to even talk about racism and prejudice in the classroom. So this kind of comes back to the core question of what can universities do to support teachers who we know want to do this work, and when they do this work, it makes a difference. And in New Jersey, we have a state law that requires education about genocides and the Holocaust. That has created a commission in our Department of Education called the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education, and that commission works with every university and college in the state of New Jersey, public and private, to support and even fund programs related to anti-racist education and human rights education broadly conceived. This is incredibly important because developing these lessons is hard. It's not easy, right? If you have a situation where you're in a school where all of a sudden there's an uptick in bias and discrimination against gay students or trans students, teachers don't necessarily know how to go in and mediate that situation or how to teach content that directly helps. Universities have the resources to support and help teachers develop pedagogy, develop curriculum and content, and develop and deliver these lessons in the classroom pretty quickly even. And so when we have commissions like the one in New Jersey that supports what's going on at my university, it creates a system where I can support teachers in the community by providing resources and teacher training workshops and programs directly to them. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is another example of the kind of infrastructure that can support teachers and educators trying to teach about human rights. This is a controversial issue in a lot of schools, and by having these things that we can point to, in New Jersey it's a state law, but around the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stands in this position, and it offers all of us, educators, parents, citizens, community members, ways to support teachers in their efforts to teach about human rights. And it's one of the things I'd like to see us do is really strengthen the way that we can support educators in K through 12 schools in teaching about human rights using this document. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for their excellent presentations. Before we proceed to the Q&A session, I would like to thank once again the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights for her presence, that she needs to depart, but we appreciate very much her presence today here today with us.
Thank you.
Now I have a few questions of my own for the distinguished panelists, but before I do them, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. So if anyone in the room, including from the panelists of the second panel, by the way, if you have any questions or comments to make, please be as brief as possible and introduce yourself when doing so. And please, you can press the mic, and then the technician in the booth will open the mic for you. Is anyone who would like to take the floor? Yes.
Hi, I'm Eduardo Avalos from Mexico. We have an accreditation agency. We evaluate universities all over Latin America. And we have seen that the main problem is that universities don't even apply human rights to their teachers. That's not a reality in universities. The salaries are offensive. The conditions for them are offensive. Mental health regarding teachers is quite worrying. So I think that we should start first changing the university, and then we can help students.
Muchas gracias por su comentario. And I'm inclined to give the floor to Susan Khan to respond about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. In my mind, education is so undervalued as a public good that increasingly, at least in the United States and other places like I know in Germany and Canada, they rely on sessional or contract instructors who get paid way less than a living wage. And so, undergraduate students aren't going to have the same professor because a lot of these faculty members come in and out, and there isn't that kind of stability. So, I'm like I said, I'm a trade unionist. I'm elected leadership of my union here at CUNY, and that's a political problem, right? It's a political problem with a human rights solution, but it requires deep mobilization, and the hardest thing to do is convince people that they're worth the fight. So, I support it 100%. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other comment or question in the room? The gentleman over there, you have the floor, sir.
Hello, my name is Alex Rawson. I'm a master's candidate studying international affairs at the New School. My question is there more that we, and in particular educational institutions, should be doing to educate people on their rights under the UDHR?
The question is addressed to somebody specific, or?
In general.
Sure. Does anyone would like to reply to that?
Thanks for your question. I think it's, the students really do have very loud, voices, and they can actually demand that their universities and their colleges have human rights courses. And, as someone who was an expert in both U.S. law and international human rights law, there really are very, very different things. And so even if someone has a basic civics education, which many people actually don't have these days, they really sort of understand our world and our, at least in the U.S., a country from a constitutional perspective, which is very defensive documents, right? The Constitution protects us against, sort of governmental infringement on some rights, whereas human rights are much more positive. And it really is critical for young people in universities, to actually think about the world in terms of human rights. And I mean, even in my since I've been teaching for 30 years at this point, I mean, the language has changed, and younger people are saying, it is my human right to do X, or is my human right to do Y. And that's true, but they refer to provisions of the Universal Declaration. They don't know it, or other treaties. But that really is in conflict often with U.S. law, which actually doesn't recognize those rights. So really, in order for the Universal Declaration to be widely accepted and for its articles to actually come into fruition, it really is critical for students to actually ask for courses in human rights law, and really to talk about human rights law in comparison to the law in whatever country they are, to show the difference.
Thank you. I believe, student, yes, you have the floor. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Rayma Hooper, and I am currently a sophomore at Lehigh University studying community and global health with a minor in molecular biology. And my question is for Professor Kang. I wanted to address something that you said that I truly admire. You said that universities are under political attack. And I have, in my experience on campus, seen that students with differing views regarding a myriad of political issues, instead of conducting conversations with one another and addressing their differences, they tend to erase posters or erase chalk that's right outside the library, or tear down posters inside different places in residence halls. And so I was wondering what your university has done to conduct the spaces for better conversation for people with opposing views.
I think that's a really great question. And when I made that statement, I was talking about like sort of more political forces rather than sort of internal interactions between students. And I think that's like an interesting thing. We do have like events where we ask like various student clubs to discuss things, but right, political debate is difficult because oftentimes people have strong emotional ties to positions they have, and they're not interested in having debates that are based on like rational arguments and data. So that's, in my mind, is more about teaching norms about like, debate and discussion that are respectful. So people don't feel that their identities and emotional ties are being attacked. And so I think that that's a little bit different than what I'm concerned about. I thought what you were going to ask is that people who feel that they have minority positions on campus will often recruit powerful outside actors to amplify their views, which is a real problem here that's been happening in New York. So rather than ask for, can we just sort of have like a panel discussion, they'll bring in like kind of mostly, and I'm a very political person, so I don't have apologies for this, but right-wing, corporate-backed actors to create narratives of being deeply repressed. And I'm thinking about this, and for example, it's not university-based, but the way that powerful rich people funded the Supreme Court case against affirmative action, and they like searched so hard to try to find people who felt that they were like, harmed by affirmative action, and they couldn't find like a single American. They found like a Canadian person who was going to school in the US, right? So, and that's sort of like this fake astroturfing of political discussion. And that's sort of what, in my mind, really stifles democratic participation on campuses.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to anybody else in the room, I have some questions of my own. First to Jackie, you mentioned the emphasis of yours on social economic rights. So I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between sustainable development and the SDGs in particular with human rights? And some people say, well, human rights are kind of related. I say myself, the SDGs are a framework for human rights, but what's your take on that?
Thanks. Yeah, so for me, really, again, back to the UDHR, I think the idea of indivisibility and interdependence is absolutely key. So for me, I think sustainable development goals are an incredibly important framework. I see them as complementary. I don't see them as opposing in any way. I personally also believe in a political project, and I think that we have to attempt perhaps by any means possible to achieve the same things, whether the development agenda might do it in some terrains and human rights might do it in other terrains. So I think we just have to keep trying as much as we can. And I just wanted to make a point about to circle back to two of those questions. I think I completely agree with my colleagues that this is all about consciousness raising in education, about making people aware of the fact that, for example, tax policy isn't nuclear physics. It's a political choice. Other countries do it in other ways. These are choices people make. All of the problems that we are seeing are political problems, hence something that education can contribute towards overcoming. So I think that absolutely, I don't see any problem with pursuing a development agenda and a human rights agenda. I see them as very complementary. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And with Zoe, I was fascinated by this relationship between the education that is provided in universities and how it can help education at lower levels. But that connection seems very obvious when you speak about it, but then in practice, what are the challenges? Because of course, you cannot teach a preschooler or a K-12 kid, you cannot say the same things, use the same examples or plain language. So how difficult is to make the transition, if I may, from the higher education level to the other levels of education?
Yeah, it is challenging. And I think scholars have an important role to play by bringing some of the really cutting edge information that's being gleaned from different disciplines and sharing that information with teachers. So to take just one example, I did a professional development workshop a couple of weeks ago with some high school teachers on the subject of Native American history in the United States. And these were a group of absolutely wonderful, very experienced, dedicated junior high school and high school teachers in New Jersey, and they were all really committed and interested in knowing about this question, like how do we teach about Native American history and culture and politics more effectively in the classroom. And I actually sat down and talked with them before I went in and did the program, and I said kind of like, what would help you? Like, what do you need? And then I can figure out what to bring to you. And one of the things that they wanted was to understand and to kind of be caught up on new scholarship in the field of Native American studies, which comes not only from historians, but anthropologists and scholars from different fields. And they wanted to be made aware of what are the new trends in the scholarship. How does that create a different narrative or a different story or different information from what we find in our high school history textbooks or the other curriculum materials that are easily available? And then how do we kind of bridge that gap? How do we bring those two things together in a way that's going to be effective and make use of kind of the structures that are in place in the schools, but also some of the limitations that are in place in the schools. And so we were able to do that and really talk about some of the exciting developments in Native American history and scholarship, especially tribal critical race theory, and how indigenous scholars and educators want Americans, right, to think about different ways to teach about Native American history, culture, and futures. And bringing that to teachers and then giving them some hands-on examples, right, of here's something you can do in the classroom, right? Here's an actual activity we can do in the classroom where you can bring in students, ask them to log into these websites that I can point them towards that are developed and curated by Native American journalists and scholars, and use that information to learn something new and to change the way they're thinking about Native American history. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I will add to your words, actually, to give more confidence to, or to have more trust in high schoolers, actually. I mentioned that because I was 2 weeks ago in my home country. I'm from Venezuela, and I went to the university where I used to teach international human rights law, and I was very grateful for the discussion. And then I went to my old high school, and I was cautious by teachers, be careful. Of course, Venezuela is a complicated country to speak about human rights, but I was pleasantly surprised to see the interventions from 14-year-old, 15-year-old students with university-level interventions. I'm very frank and very open, so it changed my mindset because normally I don't deal with high school students, but the level of interest and passion that they also have on this subject, it is fascinating. So I just wanted to add that. Is there any other comment or question? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Joy. I'm a student at SUNY Oswego. I have to add to the conversation and kind of a question. I'm kind of looking for responses from the panelists in terms of when is it too early to start the conversation on human rights? Like you mentioned, K through 12. That's been one of the biggest worries and things I've thought about through my experience as a student and like just growing up. I moved to the U.S. in 2017. I was 14. I was at the end of my high school at 14 in Nigeria, but in the US, because of the standard, I had to go all the way back to 9th grade. So, but for me, it was an experience of trying to understand, okay, how are we having these conversations? Because for me, I was about to go into college, right? Though the educational system might have been different, but it was like, I was seeing these very learned high school students are not babies, in my opinion, and they're able to handle certain conversations, but we had a lot of blocks from parent associations. Like, how can the educational system kind of manage that I know they're minors when you're in high school, so parents are very much involved in that whole process of K through 12. However, how do we manage that to instill the idea of freedom of thought and to encourage that mindset? Because college is 4 years of your life. You have the building years in high school and in middle school, and I think it's very important to increase or amplify conversations about this in that time of their life. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know which one of you would like to reply to that.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think it's important for it to start at the very beginning. And as I said in my comments, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is written so incredibly simply by design, right? There's incredibly sophisticated people who wrote it. They easily could have used language that was much more complicated, and they really chose not to, because I think they really wanted everybody to be touched by these universal principles. And they're really, they really are, very, very basic. And you can teach them to 3-year-olds. You really, really can. Everybody, is equal. Everybody has the same rights. Everybody's entitled to an education. Everybody is entitled to freedom of thought. So they really are basic principles. And, to the extent somebody is, terrified of, oh, this is an international document and there's some sort of conspiracy and, we don't trust these foreign things, you can just teach these principles and not say that they come from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But really, everybody should really internalize all of these things So that, I guess the other question is like, how do you get people to talk to each other? Well, I think that if you really do teach these principles at a very, very young age, that by the time someone does get to the university level, that you can have a real discourse and you can actually agree to disagree on some things. And then you can also find commonality in, recognizing that every person has the same rights, and we have the same rights to be here. We have the same right to occupy space. And so, from day one, is the short answer.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Ali, yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Ali Mazzara, Long Island University, here with a wonderful group of students and colleagues. I have a question to the last panelist. I'm sorry, I didn't remember your name, but you were talking about how if you were doing one intervention, or about one area, it was seen that it helped in other areas related to racism, and you said that we've seen that it works. It sounds like there must have been studies or documentation of that. Would you be able to share any of that? Because that might be helpful in trying to promote going forward on those areas. I'm not sure you're talking to me.
Yes. Okay, great. And your question was documentation about the effectiveness of tolerance education specifically?
Right. You were saying if you did one in one area, then it was found that it would help the students in other areas also be open to that. And you said we found that it worked, so I was just wondering what documentation or things that we could look at for supporting that.
Okay, great. I have to mic it up. Thanks for your question. I don't think I can cite the names of the scholars who have those papers off the top of my head, so sorry to disappoint you. But there is definitely a body of scholarship that looks at this question of essentially kind of what happens when K through 12 educators do the work, the hard work of trying to promote basically tolerance. Tolerance is the most generic word we can use. More recently in the US, you see people talking about anti-racist education as a kind of more deliberately interventionist, I guess, approach to the same idea. But no matter how you frame it, the goal is usually the same or very similar in that we're trying to get young people to be more thoughtful and cautious about stereotyping, right? There's kind of a process here in the pedagogy. And we begin by helping young people to understand and recognize stereotypes, why they're problematic, what happens when stereotypes become part of the lived reality of somebody's world in terms of prejudice, and what happens when individual prejudice develops into something that is hardened into something like state-sponsored prejudice, right? So now we have schools that are discriminating against people, or employment or housing that's discriminating against people. And oftentimes, when you start breaking down these things in one category, say you're talking about discrimination against Jewish people during World War II, or even against trans people in the United States today, students make connections, either implicitly or teachers can help making those connections more explicitly. And so they do start to recognize the kind of broader issues at stake here, right? Like, what does it mean to have a stereotype? How are stereotypes produced through social media? How can we combat these stereotypes? What does it take to intervene? And one of the things that a lot of human rights educators advocate is helping to understand young people how to be upstanders instead of bystanders when they're witnessing a case of prejudice, or even if they're seeing or hearing about a stereotype, right? Instead of just being a bystander and not saying anything when your friend uses a word as an insult that might not be okay, but it doesn't really cross any boundaries, right? Be an upstander. Say, hey, we don't use that word here. That's not cool. Please don't say that. And those small acts and helping students to recognize those processes really can have widespread effects in other areas. So please email me, and I'd be happy to send you the citations for the scholarship. But a lot of it is recent in the past 15 or 20 years, and it's easy to find.
Thank you so much. I'll give the floor to Maher.
Thank you. Maybe just a reminder, 1948, when the UDHR was adopted, the majority of the current member states of the United Nations were still colonized. They were not free. So as these diplomats here adopted this great document with all of these rights, the majority of humanity did not enjoy them. Even in the countries, in the United States, African Americans were still living in Jim Crow laws. Last March, we invited Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, and you can find his speech on YouTube that he spoke about it. And he analyzed and spoke about racial prejudice that you mentioned, the history of how it develops and the power of narrative. That the narratives that come from the society, sometimes from schools, but also from the places of worship. Some people quote the scriptures, and this is God-given right to us and not to others. It is these things that have the influence that universities have to really address. And I think when we talk about these principles, we have to be mindful of the fact that the quote I used at the beginning, political expediency. I think academics do not have political expediency. They want to educate, they want to excel, they want to open minds. They might want to achieve tenure, they might want to achieve research, et cetera, but they don't necessarily, there is political expediency to some extent, but politicians are all about political expediency. And I think this is where the critical thinking and the commitment to the principles that can really make a difference is when it can. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we conclude the first panel to examine how the University Declaration is when it's about to commemorate or celebrate its 75th anniversary. We'll now going to make a pause of 5, and I repeat that, just 5 minutes, so don't go far, and then we will resume with the second panel. Thank you so much. And we're back. Thank you very much for those who stayed. And now that we heard the discussion and the reflection on the validity, if I may say, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how important universities are for the implementation, now we are going to hear about actual things happening in universities. But we have a combination of speakers here. We have, on one hand, we have scholars and researchers from the universities, and we also have students from universities that were going to tell us about their views and what they do in practice, both on campus and beyond. So allow me to introduce first Jocelyn Kestenbaum, Professor of Law, Director of the Benjamin Ferencz Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic and the Cardoso Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights and the Benjamin Cardoso School of Law, Yeshiva University. Her scholarship focuses on human rights, public health, and atrocity prevention. She's also the co-editor of Public Health, Mental Health, and Mass Atrocity Prevention. We also have Catherine Liebel, Director of the Glasstein Family Human Rights Institute, and Associate Professor of Social Work and Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. She specializes in refugee, resettlement, and social welfare, serves on the Executive Committee on the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, and co-edited Human Rights in the United States Beyond Exceptionalism. We also have with us, for this second panel, Rita Varma, Director of Critical Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Studies, and full professor in the Ruth S. Ammon College of Education and Health Sciences at Adelphi University. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of Critical Debates in Humanities, Science, and Global Justice, and worked as the director of the UN Conference on Teaching for Peace and Human Rights. She's also the co-editor of Disrupting Hate in Education. And we have, of course, our wonderful 4 students from 4 different universities. Abigail Kerensky, student at Long Island University. Anne-Lies Preske, student at Seton Hall University. Mateo Mortellaro, student at the State of University of New York, New Paltz. And Rima Hooper, student at Lehigh University. So I welcome you all. There was a slight change in the program. I will moderate in this panel as well, with endorsement of my colleague from OECHR, Laura. And each of you, because we are a larger number here of panelists, so I do ask you to keep your remarks tight to 5 minutes. I will make this noise when it's about 30 seconds to go. And then we're also going to have, of course, timing for Q&A and discussion. I give the floor to Jocelyn. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to all of the presenters and other panelists as well. I first want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Benjamin N. Cardoso School of Law and also the United Nations are situated in Manhattan in Lenape-Hocking, the Lenape homeland. I pay respects to the Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. At Cardoso, I direct the Cardoso Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights and the Benjamin B. Ferencz Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic. The Ferencz Clinic trains law students in international human rights and atrocity prevention practice and advocacy, and so for that reason, I consider myself to be more of a pracademic. The clinic provides students with supervised hands-on training in real-world cases and contexts, training the next generation of human rights advocates, and offering them an opportunity to develop legal skills in international human rights law practice while working toward implementing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and toward making its ideals a reality. So each clinic student team partners with affected communities, human rights non-governmental organizations, and international law experts to support litigation before international and regional tribunals. In the process, they investigate human rights violations, they draft amicus briefs on indigenous rights, gender justice, genocide, and slavery and the slave trade. They contribute to cutting-edge academic and policy scholarship, and they engage in strategic advocacy before the UN and other international and domestic bodies. The Human Rights Clinic was named for the late, great Benjamin B. Ferencz former Nazi war crimes investigator, chief prosecutor of the Einsatzgruppen case at Nuremberg, and longtime advocate for rule of law and international justice. Also my friend. Ben passed away last year in his 103rd year of life. His work and legacy toward law, not war, lives on through the clinic's work in human rights and atrocity prevention legal advocacy. The atrocities of the Holocaust teach us that governments and private actors alike use the law to encourage discrimination, promote violence, and justify a range of crimes. And out of the ashes of World War II came the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, among other instruments, to protect and promote human rights. Our work implements the ideals of the UDHR by challenging those who would pursue a similar path today, including those who would intentionally discriminate against groups and commit mass atrocities and genocide in the service of extremist populism, nationalism, and aggressive war. At the same time, we recognize the limitations of the Declaration, and so we also seek to make the Universal Declaration truly universal. And how do we do this? We take a critical, intersectional lens to human rights, bringing in third world approaches to international law, critical race theory, and many other intersectional lenses in recognition that many of the individuals with whom we partner represent groups of people who were not at the table at the time of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We work toward ensuring that their voices are centered, included, and heard. So we focus primarily on places that do not make headlines, communities where current or past levels of identity-based violence are as great or even greater in better-known crises. We work in close collaboration with local partners, individuals, communities who are targeted for identity-based discrimination and violence, and who often fight for their right to exist. We work with our partners to challenge, overturn, reform laws that frequently target members of indigenous groups, other minorities, and other excluded peoples. And we challenge governments that try to use the law to deny the nationality, human rights, and even at times the humanity of individuals and groups, often as part of campaigns to exclude individuals, expel groups, or commit mass atrocities, including genocide, slavery, and the slave trade. So one of the really important things that we do is to ensure that multiple and diverse worldviews are respected. We call this the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but if we really want to make this universal, we will accept the pluriverse that really is our world, that there are many ways of looking at human rights, and we must really take all of the other documents that have come post the UDHR and ensure that those frameworks are included and maybe even respected, protected, and fulfilled in the way that the rights are meant to in the Universal Declaration. So, in short, I want my students to rediscover the reason that they came to law school, because many of them lose that the minute they come into law school. It's a place of privilege and a place of power, and it's a place where the status quo could be upheld if they wanted to. I always tell my students, you now have a superpower, and how will you use it? And I hope that they will all use it for the better and to really make the UDHR a reality.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Catherine.
The organizers and Mr. Hernandez for the work that he put into making this possible today. I'd just like to say it's extraordinary that we are here not only on recognizing the 75th anniversary of the UDHR, but also the 30th anniversary of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the 75th anniversary of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is being recognized this week as well. And I direct the University of Connecticut's Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute. We're an interdisciplinary institute at a public university. We're the first public university to have a major in human rights. Grew out of a minor that was really demanded by students even before the institute was formed. And we've had extraordinary growth in the last 2 decades, in part because students have really pressed for the expansion of these programs, and the university has been open to doing so. We're made up of 15 core faculty and another 35 affiliate faculty across the university. So unlike some centers, we're not located in a school of law. we're grounded in many disciplinary perspectives that can be brought to bear in human rights. And I think in that way, we are able to animate the UDHR and think about professions and practices that would take human rights perspectives across any field of work. And so I'm an anthropologist who teaches in a school of social work, and the profession of social work in the United States is required for accreditation purposes to teach human rights principles of advocacy and practice, even though we know that in reality most professors aren't trained to do so, and we're still at the very early stages of being able to realize this within that particular profession. So we have more than 250 undergraduate and graduate students, a fairly new master's program, a graduate certificate in human rights that's often taken by doctoral students who are in training who want added training in human rights. When I was a graduate student, there really were very few courses in human rights in anthropology or any of the other social science disciplines that I would have been training in. And our programs have developed over the last 3 decades in part because not only of our students, but our alumni who've been wanting to see some change in the way in which higher ed is carried out. And so we have a range of pedagogical research and public engagement programs, including in our newly formed DOD Human Rights Impact, which is actually run by colleagues you may be familiar with, James Waller, who works very much in the space of human rights, genocide, and Holocaust prevention education. So, grounded in initially an archive that was formed in 1995 in the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, we now have a number of programs across the university. And I would say that while the UDHR is really critical, it's the foundation of much of our work, in our programs themselves, we're actually drawing most often, I think, on things like general comments and general recommendations that actually inform the treaties that followed. So in social work, it doesn't matter whether we've ratified the Convention on the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You can still use the ideas in the ICSCR, drawing on the extraordinary insights for policymaking and for transformation that exist in general recommendations. And you can also train widely that we are bound. We've ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and when you're talking about inequities, you can be grounding your arguments in human rights arguments, as we often see community members are very interested in doing, as are our students. So our School of Social Work, for example, requires that students are familiar with CERD. They read the UDHR, yes, but then they deeply engage CERD because it's something they can actually use, engage, they can create shadow reports, they can potentially do advocacy at a state level. Or more recently in Connecticut, social work students led an effort to have the state adopt the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, drawing in standards from Sweden around child well-being and thinking especially about poverty and inequality within our state, which is one of the most unequal states in the country and has amongst some of the deepest racial segregation that you'll find anywhere. And social work students worked to campaign and to see that the legislature would pass this bill. It did not succeed. The parental rights groups swooped in at the very end, but the idea exists and could be carried forward. And I guess I would just say in closing, knowing that we could pick any one of the articles of the UDHR and explore. And indeed, I have a colleague who's actually doing a big presentation on the article related to the right to leisure. But I would say that today we really want to be thinking about Article 28. I work on migration-related issues. Many work on climate. And the article says, everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. It's clear now more than ever that we must work collectively to realize this transformational right, and higher education has a critical role to play in the process. Now, I did note Mr. Nasser's phrase from Volker Turk, that we must take fearless steps towards such transformation, and I couldn't agree more.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Rita Varma.
Okay. Thank you. So for over 20 years, I've been a faculty member in teacher education and a director of critical peace and human rights studies. Today, I want to ask the question, what ways can storytelling move us to think and act in powerful ways to disrupt dominant forms? Can schools provide the radical space for storytelling and interruptive pedagogy in the context of advocating for human rights? As we process stories and engage in storytelling, our understandings of them also stem from the kaleidoscope of the lenses we all bear. To ask one to dismantle and reflect on the manner they reflect requires disruption, and such disruption requires a critical emotional reflexivity. At any one moment, we can all be guilty of being situated in a realm of power and privilege. For example, I could say I'm Sikh American in an affluent neighborhood. To much extent, as a South Asian, I've embraced the model minority label and clearly upper middle class, but then suddenly feel the discomfort when they are positioned as a terrorist and racially profiled. We all simultaneously face that slippery slope of privilege, nationhood, and fragmented belonging. When we aspire to enact global change with storytelling practices in our college classrooms, let us stop to process the ways the global arena is talking back to that very idea. Why are the deafening sounds of the stories of hate and war being normalized? As geographic spaces are expanded and reconfigured in regard to citizenship within borders, what does it mean to engage in dialogue about seamless borders or global citizenship, especially when we continue to reconfigure and rewrite the discourse of belonging within nations? The idea of global citizenship faces challenges in terms of realization of participatory, equal, just human relations and universal access to power. How can we learn to live with the otherness of others? How can we, and to those that we feel their ways are deeply threatening to our own? Nation states are being deeply entrenched in policies that exclude, demand assimilation, and further outright ban traditions and customs that appear endangering to romantic notions of what it means to belong in nation states. As we expose intersectionalities between historical memory, human suffering, and lived experiences, peace and human rights praxis may become engaged, and hence we begin to grapple with this idea called peace. Critical peace education in many ways is that struggle over contested identities, symbolic violence, and its meaning, as well as shared ownership of the pedagogical space. I'd like to share a few examples of what I frame as an unofficial curriculum that requires a presence of a learner and a teacher activist. I frame unofficial curriculum as a space between the official curriculum and the outright resistance to it. That space where educators develop transformative lessons that are not in the daily lesson plan. There are moments in the classroom where teachers have rewritten or developed opportunities for their students that are creative and deeply critical, and then they plant the seed to shape activists and global citizens. To occupy these spaces on the margins, educators are both engaged in mandated curriculum, yet need to be transformative and engage in a critical peace pedagogy, and do this within resistance and interrupt. These counter-hegemonic spaces are rich with dialogue, and the unexpected, because of their unpredictability, radical openings cannot always be realized. These unofficial curriculums deserve notice. An unofficial marginal curriculum can also teach students about how to answer back to those messages and be empowered. And within that unofficial curriculum, students engage and understand peace praxis as a relational encounter that is contextualized in the lives of others. Students learn to critically view the world around them and are challenged to view themselves as part of a greater society. A fellow educator engages art to introduce human rights. Students are asked to reflect upon an abstract painting called Tereska Draws Her Home by David Seymour from 1948. They're then asked to share the emotions they sense from this young girl and her depiction of home. Home in this image is chaotic, abstract, and is depicted with multiple lines and circles coming together. Students are asked to transplant her struggle to identify a home with current-day populations that are displaced, stateless, and homeless. Finally, how might home be located and provided? Students are asked to bring imagery that depicts these sentiments today and write a creative narrative about that. A student brought in the image of the deceased toddler on the beach shore in Turkey named Aylan Kurdi and appropriated the voice of the child and said, "I have left this world now. I am a small boy. My parents took me away from my land to find safety, food, shelter, education, a new life, a new home. My life ended very young. I will never know the world for all its beauty. Please make room and love for other children like me. We ask only for a safe world to live and grow up in. Another student wrote a narrative about young girls who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. I slept in my mother's arms one night and awoke to strangers beating down our door. It was Boko Haram. I was kidnapped, stolen, taken away. I have not ever been back home. My home is now a world of darkness, violence, and trauma. I am not who I was when I was taken that night. Now I am what Boko Haram wants me to be. Home is the jungle. Home is fear. Home has been stolen. Finally, a student shared an image of a wall in order to speak about divisions that borders create. My land was sliced like a pie. It was given a name. I was told I no longer belonged. The pie was all taken away, leaving me with dust and an empty bag to carry back to nowhere. There is no longer a home. Home is occupied by a name that tells me that I am not wanted. The home I want is not home. The place I was told is my home does not feel right. It'll be an empty bag and where my footprints can lead me, perhaps near or far, but home is not there. So these are kind of living artifacts of history where students are taking past and present and bringing it together to create a narrative. So there's many, many examples I could share. I know we're a little bit limited before time, but I'd like to end with something I asked my teachers that I'm training in terms of how they view themselves. And I tell them that as new teachers in training, reflection on becoming aware and unlearning positions of entitlement and privilege are valuable and sensitive starting points. Unlike an indoctrination or a curriculum on how to do peace, possibilities of becoming an activist should ideally be explored within mutual conversations of willing agents. The vision to make pre-service teachers aware about their embeddedness and multiple layers of dominant discourse and is a practice in humanization, and with the intention of these ideas being multiplied with their own classrooms. We need to view these practices as acts of empowerment and an awakening to how we are all deeply embedded and can be simultaneously oppressor and oppressed in context. Through these mediums, I ask my teachers in training to capture the essence of their role as sculptors of possibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Abigail.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Abigail Kerensky, and I'm an undergraduate student at Long Island University's Global College. Global College is a unique bachelor's program which offers students the opportunity to spend 7 out of 8 semesters outside of the U.S. Throughout my college career, I had the opportunity to study in 5 different countries and travel to over 20 while learning about the world's most relevant issues, including economic and social inequality, the climate crisis, war and conflict, and most relevant to today, human rights. It is an honor to be here today, and I thank Mr. Omar Hernandez and the UN Academic Initiative for this invitation, and thank you for your time now. Although all of us on this student panel are young, our generation is the future, and soon enough we will also be leaders and teachers and much more, and soon enough it will be our generation's responsibility to fix the world's most pressing issues. As we address one of the most pressing issues here today, universal human rights, I want to highlight a community that is often being denied their human rights and ultimately left behind: persons with disabilities. According to the World Health Organization, there are an estimated 1 billion people in the world living with a disability. This is the world's largest minority group, and 80% of persons with disabilities live in developing countries. The inequalities faced by individuals with disabilities are intolerable. For all of their lives, individuals with disabilities are trying to adjust and fit into a world that is not designed for them. It is time that we instead adjust and make the world accessible for them. It should not be their responsibility alone. It should be all of ours. Thanks to the LIU Global College curriculum, my classmates and I are offered the opportunity to conduct an international intensive internship and research semester in the fall of our senior year. We choose a location around the world to go and live and research a pressing global issue of our choice. It is this opportunity that allowed me to learn so much about the challenges faced by the deaf and deafblind communities around the world, and why I've become a dedicated advocate for these communities. I just completed my internship at a school in New York, which educates children who are deaf, deafblind, and deaf-disabled. Throughout my internship, I conducted a research case study on the methods used by teachers and other professionals to create an inclusive space for children with disabilities in school. While exploring the topic of education for deaf, deafblind, and deaf-disabled children on a global scale, I have been shocked by the challenges and barriers these individuals face. Unfortunately, many of these barriers have to do with misconceptions and assumptions around deafness and deafblindness. In many cases, simply hiring an interpreter could offer a deaf or deafblind individual the ability to communicate and participate, but many organizations, schools, and workplaces continue to decline these individuals anyways. According to the World Federation of the Deaf, there are more than 70 million deaf people worldwide. But the shocking truth is that it is estimated that 80% of the 70 million deaf people receive no education at all. That is approximately 56 million deaf individuals not in school. This is a profound breach to the universal right to education. Without education, these individuals become even more vulnerable and experience even greater barriers and greater challenges. So the stereotypes, the misconceptions, and low expectations will only be fueled, leading to more barriers and more discrimination. I spent last summer working directly with deafblind youth and adults, and I can tell you firsthand that these individuals are underestimated. I'm sure you have heard of the most well-known deafblind individual, Helen Keller. Recently, social media was flooded with rumors that Helen Keller was fake. People believe that it is impossible for a deafblind individual to learn how to read, how to write, and how to talk. And some people even ask if deafblind people can think. This conversation around Helen Keller completely dehumanizes deafblind individuals around the world. Deafblind individuals are capable of learning, working, communicating, and they even developed their own language through touch. It is not deafblind people's lack of skills or lack of ability, but it is a lack of awareness and lack of accessibility that leaves them behind. As a society, we need to do better. There have been areas of growth, but we are not quite there yet. Human rights are still being denied, education is not accessible, and employment is not equal. We need to continue educating individuals on diversity and inclusion. We must educate ourselves on the communities we know little about, and we must share our knowledge to educate others. We must highlight our differences in a positive light, not a negative one. I believe that the more knowledge and awareness we share, the deeper understanding and acceptance we will receive. We still have a lot of work to do to make the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a reality. I thank you for this opportunity to share my work with the deaf and deafblind populations and highlight how we can contribute to providing them with the rights they deserve. Thank you.
And Liz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Hernandez, Mr. Nasser, and Ms. Gilbert for facilitating such a wonderful event. I would also like to thank the United Nations Academic Impact for creating this platform to amplify young voices. For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. These words, written by Elie Wiesel, were my first introduction to the study of human rights. As an English major, I was already familiar with the power of writing, but this was different. I realized that although I might be new to the world of human rights, I was already an advocate. My mother, who is perhaps my biggest supporter, taught me how to advocate. Following close behind her were my teachers and professors. How to advocate for myself and others by using the skills and resources I had. In 2017, I bore witness to the displacement of migrants in Italy who had come from across the Mediterranean. I would visit them in informal settlements and listen to their journeys from Algeria, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Afraid that I would forget, I began to write them down. At the time, I didn't think of this as advocacy. I just knew that I felt responsible to do something with the stories I was trusted with. When I returned to my undergraduate institution in Cleveland, Ohio, John Carroll University, I began to write. With the help of my professors in the English, political science, and Italian departments, I developed these stories into narrative nonfiction works, blending oral histories and political analysis to inform others. I followed the same model when I wrote about the refugee experience in northeastern Ohio the following year. My professors were the catalyst that turned my ideas into plans. Advocating for human rights transcends the boundaries of academic disciplines. From liberal arts to social science to STEM, human rights are always salient. Over the summer, I participated in a conference where I met scholars and practitioners who changed the course of my life. One thing in common with each person who I talked to was that they were all mission-driven with the desire to contribute to the global good, regardless of their career backgrounds. You do not have to be a scholar in human rights to leverage your passion for change. Advocates need to be present in every discipline. By blending teaching methodologies with a human rights perspective, you empower your students to become advocates for change. Last year, I began my graduate program at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. My academic experience fueled my passion to realize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My professors taught me about international relations and then showed me how to be an advocate in the field. In the spring, I took the United Nations Field Seminar course taught by Father Brian Muthas. He bridged theory and practice by taking students to various country missions and NGOs to learn the importance of multilateralism. Meeting with UN practitioners led me to research the human rights implications of economic sanctions. I advocated by writing op-eds and policy memos. I was inspired by Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security. As a part of the National Security Fellowship, I learned how to conduct research and analysis in the field of security. I looked into the information environment and the offline implications of online activity. I advocated for our research to be considered by policymakers. I was inspired by Article 28, the right to a free and fair world. Higher ed fosters a community of emerging leaders, and while I am here with you today, I represent my colleagues at Seton Hall and all students looking to make the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a reality. I would like to highlight how some of my colleagues use their passions to make a difference. Hatem, who used his interpretation skills to assist migrants seeking asylum in New York City. Article 14, everyone has the right to seek asylum from persecution. Elizabeth, who championed global health care with Shot at Life. Article 25, everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living. Hamza, who wrote policy proposals on protecting the religious freedom of Muslims in North New Jersey. Article 7, we are all equal before the law. And Etta, who led a seminar on the rights of women. Article 2, everyone is entitled to rights without distinction. These students exemplify how a community of higher education can have a positive societal impact. It starts with understanding and advocating for Article 1, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Mateo.
And thank you, Mr. Hernandez, and thank you to Academic Impact for organizing this panel. So my name is Mateo Mortellaro, and I'm finishing up my final semester of undergraduate studies at the State University of New York at New Paltz, so I'm very happy to be representing a public university. I'm studying international relations with a minor in Asian studies, and I'm currently finishing up a program known as the Global Engagement Program, which has brought me here to New York City to complete my bachelor's degree in international relations and engage at an internship at Religions for Peace, an interfaith network which some of you may be familiar with. So this program seeks to engage students with the international system both academically through a semester-long intensive and practically with relevant internships across a variety of sectors. To those of us fortunate enough to have participated in this program, just 10 of us this semester, it has contributed significantly to how we as students understand, interpret, and even see ourselves fitting within this international system. No doubt that this program has contributed significantly to the inclusion of the United Nations and the UDHR within university curriculum by giving students the opportunities to study and witness firsthand the vast network of actors that can be called the international system. Along with my time at Religions for Peace, where I've been working as a programs intern, I've also been engaged in research on indigenous ecological knowledge, also known as traditional ecological knowledge, and the necessity of providing international legal protections for indigenous communities so that this valuable knowledge can be preserved and utilized. The issues facing indigenous communities globally represents a critical intersection of issues imperative to the climate crisis. Indigenous communities around the world face neglect and, in many cases, systemic repression and disenfranchisement, which in turn has led to a definitive decline in this valuable traditional ecological knowledge. At the same time, the climate crisis is disproportionately affecting indigenous communities, many of whom have not even engaged in the very industrial activities which have primarily fueled the climate crisis. My paper focuses on the connection between traditional ecological knowledge and Sustainable Development Goal 13, which aims to limit and adapt to climate change. Traditional ecological knowledge sets itself apart from Western knowledge in that it has been accumulated over thousands of years, over countless generations, and has served as the vehicle for the survival of indigenous communities who have stewarded lands as harsh as the Tibetan Plateau and have been able to understand ecosystems as complex as the Amazon rainforest. The 2022 IPCC report found that forestry, land use, and architecture accounted for up to 27% of all greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, and that emissions in these sectors are expected to continue to climb, even threatening to overshadow the gains made in the fossil fuel industry. When it comes to land-based and building-based mitigation options, indigenous ecological knowledge is particularly relevant. Indigenous regenerative farming practices, for example, have been shown to be successful not only in preserving, but also regenerating levels of biodiversity where it has previously been lost. The effects of sustainable architecture should also not be understated, as traditional ecological knowledge holds valuable lessons for sustainable building, which also has the potential to be scaled to meet modern needs, while also recalibrating the values of architectural goals to include localization, sustainability, community life, and energy efficiency. Article 3 of this monumental document, which we are celebrating today, provides that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. But as we have seen, this climate crisis is an existential threat to human life and therefore is our greatest obstacle to achieving the universality of these human rights. Likewise, indigenous communities who have contributed the least to climate change also face the worst of its effects, from intense flooding across Asia to rampant deforestation across rainforests in Africa and South America, leading not only to the threat of demise of traditional communities, but to the destruction of ecosystems integral to a stable global climate. The issues of indigenous rights are fundamentally an issue of human rights, both from the perspective of religion and from the perspective of the climate. Looking at the spiritual beliefs of many indigenous peoples around the world, it is clear that their relationship to the natural world is intrinsically linked to their spiritual customs, practices, and understandings, creating a kind of feedback loop whereby spiritual life and the natural world are nurtured together. Article 18 of this document provides for all people to have freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, yet around the world, indigenous communities continue to face discrimination and a lack of basic human rights. These two issues of human rights and of the climate are undeniably interconnected and therefore should be framed and addressed as such. In conclusion, because there is no life, liberty, or security on a dead planet, scholars and policymakers should pay more attention to indigenous communities who hold many values and cumulative knowledge to aid in solving this existential crisis, which threatens the very foundation of this Declaration of Human Rights. My research through this program supports that indigenous rights are human rights, and indigenous communities, when given the right legal protections and supports, are willing and able to preserve the ecological knowledge which has the potential to play a crucial role in shaping humanity's efforts to tackle the climate change crisis and ensure that it is not merely an issue of physical environment, but also an issue of climate justice and respect for the universality of every person's right, including future generations, to live in peace with dignity and safety. Thank you.
And now I give the floor to Rima.
In the 21st century, there are just some things that we cannot live without. Yes, I am talking about our cell phones, laptops, computers, and iPads. Have you ever thought of what types of raw materials it takes to create these transformative pieces of technology? Or who is risking their lives to mine the critical minerals that power them? According to a report released by the U.S. Geological Survey, quote, cobalt is used mostly in cathodes in rechargeable batteries, end quote, which are essential to our sustainable energy transition. Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights enshrines the right to freedom from slavery or servitude. The International Labor Organization declared 2021 as the International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. From 2016 to 2020, there was an increase of 8.4 million children working in child labor. And in 2020, the ILO reported that 160 million children, nearly 1 in 10 globally, participate in child labor, of which 79 million participate in hazardous work. Artisanal and small-scale mining relies on workers using hand tools to collect resources such as cobalt, gold, and tin, and is especially dangerous and heavily reliant upon child workers. The dangers and child labor concerns of artisanal small-scale mining demonstrate not only a violation to Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but are counter to numerous sustainable development goals, such as SDG 3, good health, SDG 7, affordable and clean technology, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 10, reduced inequalities. I would like to focus our time here today discussing SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. The Paris Declaration on Electromobility and Climate Change and Call to Action, released in 2015, greatly changed our global response to climate change and sustainability, stating that at least 20% of all road transport vehicles globally should be electrically powered by 2030. Additionally, as of this year in the United States, 10 states have officially adopted the Advanced Clean Cars 2 initiative, which seeks to prohibit gas-powered vehicles by 2035. As we gear towards more renewable forms of energy, demand for crucial minerals is anticipated to skyrocket, and the persons at the bottom of the supply chain will be increasingly relied upon for labor. In 1973, the International Labor Organization adopted Convention 138, which set the minimum age for undertaking hazardous work conditions to 18 years. In 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. The 1997 report by the ILO, entitled Child Labor in the Diamond Industry, coupled with the Clean Diamond Trade Act in 2003, built upon these monumental statutes to reduce the use of child labor in diamond mining. With all of this progress in protecting children worldwide, what will we do now to end their role in artisanal and small-scale mining? I urge the global academic community to emphasize research, investigating possible solutions for more efficient mining practices, recycling of mined materials, and just as importantly, I encourage universities to include more curriculum regarding hazardous conditions and child labor in artisanal and small-scale mining. I am honored to be a member of the panel this afternoon, full of inspiring educators and students from various fields and passions. Together, we celebrate the victories that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has already achieved and the critical work yet to be done.
with the hope of the progress made and currently underway. Let us utilize our education in this technologically expanding era to ensure that our global transition to sustainable technologies is indeed equitable for all. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished panelists of this second panel for their presentations. We have some minutes, but not too many minutes, for our Q&A. So with the endorsement of the public, I will limit quite a lot the time for comments or questions. But I do have some specific questions, and I would like to start with one question to the 4 students that just spoke. It was interesting that all of you, and I promise I didn't recruit them on purpose. This was an assignment we gave to our universities, and they gave us the names, but I didn't know any of their backgrounds beforehand. But it was quite interesting that each one of you addressed the needs or heard or spoke directly to specific groups of people, and there were different groups of people: persons with disabilities, refugees and asylum seekers, indigenous communities, and child workers. So my question to all of you, and I will keep each one of you to provide a very brief answer to that question. What would you say is the most important thing we can learn from each one of these groups? If there's just one thing that you think, and by we I mean the UN, the academic community, the international community as a whole, every single one of us, what will be the main takeaway from your research or your direct engagement with these groups of people? And I don't know which one of you would like to go first.
All right, so I'll speak specifically for the deaf-blind communities. I would say that I want everyone to be aware of the misconceptions. Being deaf-blind does not mean that you have does not necessarily mean you have no hearing and no vision. It's a wide spectrum, and that is a misconception that often causes these individuals to be stereotyped and discriminated against. And yeah, that would be the biggest thing. And then there's just as far as accessibility, creating accessible spaces, having deaf-blind individuals or deaf individuals present on panels, have them present in the room when decisions are being made, having their voices heard.
So actually it was 2 weeks ago, but we had a Nobel Peace Prize laureate come to our school. It was Madam Lima Bowie from Liberia. And I want to say a quick quote from her. This was at the speech 2 weeks ago. She said, "I see your humanity." And when I work with people, whether they're refugees, asylum seekers, or people in the defense industry, I try to see everybody's humanity, and then I try to reflect my own. And I think the number one thing that I learned from working with refugees is that they are not victims, but they are survivors, in that every person who has started on a journey, whether it be from Ethiopia or Iraq, they have all gone through incredible trials and survived. And I think that the immigration reform and asylum seeking is a really important and salient issue that is really rooted in seeing the humanity. So, thank you.
I would say with my work with indigenous communities, first of all, I was inspired by the Tibetan community in exile, which I've been fortunate to be very close with since a young age, who has inspired me greatly. I think the values, I mean, my research is talking a lot about traditional ecological knowledge, so there are a lot of kind of more concrete things about sustainable, agroforestry, sustainable hunting and fishing practices, things like that. But there are also these kind of underlying values, which you could describe as human values, but are a different set of human values than the values that drove us to kind of the brink of kind of climate catastrophe that we're at right now. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one of you it was, but somebody had mentioned, I think it was Jackie mentioned degrowth and the reduction of consumption. I think that indigenous cultures, indigenous communities, they have, a lot of them have these very values that may be able to aid us in degrowth, in a process of degrowth that for a lot of people does not really even seem conceivable. It, you know, for those of us, you know, we were born in a generation with iPads and, this kind of hyper consumerism. So for a lot of us, it's not even, we're not even able to conceive of a culture or a society that does not engage in that, but we can look to indigenous communities and indigenous cultures as inspiration and as a framework.
Yes, and on that note of how you even mentioned just the growing, I guess, consumerism aspect of our culture, especially here in the United States, I'd say it is incredibly prevalent that we remain aware of the children at the bottom of the supply chain who are in the mines sourcing these materials. And so I would say just from a few different standpoints, number one, I'm currently undertaking an independent research project investigating cobalt mining. And when I took it on, I was initially kind of discouraged because I couldn't do field work in the area, as cobalt mines or mining in general is extremely dangerous. And so I was encouraged, though, to ask more questions about my research topic, initially starting with the biological effects cobalt mining has on workers, which would require physical, obtaining of data. But I think what that led me to was really developing a passion for my generation of young people, of Gen Zers, as we like to call them, who are really interested in climate change and activism and trying to get our world to be more sustainable in our technologies. So for that area specifically of young people, young activists, even as Annalise mentioned, we need to help them understand that, yes, your phone is an incredible resource for you to connect with other people, but understand, where did those materials come from? Ask those questions. And then with those questions being asked from a university standpoint, this area of research is somewhat scarce. And that, I think, was also a reason why my university wasn't as sure of me conducting this research project because it's such a scarce area. But that is exactly what has encouraged me to come here and speak with you all today globally, that we need to embed this more into our curriculum, and we need to embed it into the people that we have come to our universities, as well as our research. So I would say those main areas is how we can get involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask something very brief to each one of the remainder panelists for the second panel. And I would like to start with Rita. You mentioned a term that it was very interesting when I heard it, interruptive pedagogy, if I understood it correctly. So I was wondering if you can perhaps define it according to your own judgment, and how do you see universities exercising that kind of pedagogy?
Okay, so the whole concept of pedagogies of interruption is a theory I've been building, and it's kind of this topic of my last book. So I see the whole need to create radical spaces in pedagogy means you're interrupting. So it requires, as I mentioned, the teacher and learner both need to be activists to actually see those spaces and have that desire to interrupt. So it's, I feel like there has to be an interruption of dominant forms, of questioning pedagogy, questioning, many symbolic violence, questioning how a university handles, moments of crisis, who is silenced, who's not. So I've kind of been developing that whole idea and calling it a pedagogy of interruption. Thank you.
Thank you. To Catherine, you mentioned during your remarks something about doing advocacy at the state level. in Connecticut. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit about that and how students, if at all, are involved in that advocacy.
Well, I gave an example from the School of Social Work, which has a mandate nationwide curricularly to teach advocacy, especially around policy, but also change at a more municipal or a local level. And so students in a course on human rights and social work will develop projects, research-based and in consultation with the placements where they do field work, about, in our university, 550 hours a year of field work, and might explore, for example, the affordability of housing or the habitability of apartments in which people are living, let's just say in Hartford. And then when they do that research, they either bring it to the municipality and inform the municipality of the dimensions of the human right to adequate housing and try to reframe thinking about housing not as something which is just a matter of profit making, but actually a public good, which is really entwined with other rights, including the right to health, and affordability of housing severely impacts the right to accessing adequate food and other dimensions of everything that's contained in the UDHR. So advocating at a state level is sometimes a pathway, especially I think for students and for folks like us, to see some change that potentially could then spread to other parts of a country which is highly devolved in terms of its social systems, pretty miserly in terms of its welfare state, and in need of great models for us to learn from one another and then press for more federal change. And so actually I drew hope from the fact that the students were drawing upon Swedish notions of child well-being and trying to translate those into a bill that would pass at the Connecticut state level. But they also drew on examples from Hawaii, which did join the CRC in the mechanism that states can join, and then New York in terms of CEDAW, which has an absolutely fabulous shadow report on CEDAW from about, I don't know, a decade ago, which helps them to then rethink child welfare, for example, vis-a-vis CERD and racial discrimination. So the students actually can either become quite overwhelmed by the grave inequities and the quite serious inadequacies of our social welfare system. That's one thing that does happen. And so we try to show examples of how you can use human rights ideas and actually have concrete change at a local level.
If I may have a follow-up question, very briefly, if you can, because the students go out and they speak to policy people, but because they are students, how well received are they and their thoughts and ideas?
Leader. Oh, sorry. It really depends on the political leader and the reception that you get. And people often think of Connecticut as being a quote-unquote blue state, but we're quite diverse on many issues. And I think just knowing how deeply unequal or inequitable we are as a state tells you that there's a ton of human rights work to be done. And the students sometimes face really sharp questions about these ideas being socialist or these ideas not really fitting with US values. And they have to be kind of ready for those questions and to, I think, respond with calm and poise and grace. And I just cannot believe the incredible insights of of the students who brought their talks to this session today. I draw a lot of encouragement, but also maybe a little bit more pressure to say there's a whole lot more that we in an earlier generation should be doing. It shouldn't all be on the shoulders of you as you're moving into these places of leadership, but we have a lot to learn from student leaders in this space.
Thank you. And last but not least, I have a couple of questions to Jocelyn, embedded into one actually. So how, we had an event last year in this actually very same conference room to mark UN Day, and one of the panelists mentioned something about decolonizing knowledge in higher education. So I bring this to our discussion today because you mentioned something that was very interesting for me to hear, the quote-unquote third world approach. So being myself from the so-called third world, I was wondering, what would you define as a third world approach to the UDHR and human rights education in general, but also how do you think universities can indeed, and if you can provide any example, decolonize human rights? Because as some of Maher mentioned, many countries were not there when the declaration was adopted, when you mentioned that yourself. But in the year 2023, when we have 193 members with completely different views on human rights, how could you manage that?
That's a great question, and I'm probably going to spend the rest of my adult life trying to find the right solution to that answer. But I would say that to start, we have to think about decolonization not as an endpoint, but as a process, and as a process of unlearning and relearning and not being aware even necessarily of the endpoint. But that is, I think, I take on losing cases. So by their nature, right? The facts are usually on our side, but the law definitely is not. They've lost generally at the domestic level, and we're taking cases to an international forum that may be more willing or able to listen to the facts and recharacterize them as violations of human rights. And so my students know that going into it, that we're, fighting against a tide, but that the process, right, we really focus on relationships. You mentioned indigenous values. I learned so much from my clients, from my partners, from affected communities on how to lawyer. And I do a lot of professional training that is about deconstructing white supremacy and racialized hierarchy and trying to make sure that, yes, my law students can navigate these spaces, but that they can understand when they are completely oppressive and need to be transformed. And so the idea is really in that relationship and reciprocity with our partners, knowing that they have the solutions, that people just haven't been listening to them and centering their voices and really amplifying their idea of how they need to move forward and really being a conduit for that and being in relationship, because really you cannot do this work without being completely demoralized or completely, maybe even threatened. I was thinking about all of your really important work, and I worry because I was where you were a couple of decades ago, and bright-eyed and pushing, and it's a very tough work that we do. I have to worry about my students being followed, being threatened by even the state at times, and mostly the state actually. So it's a hard thing that we're doing, but if we're walking with our partners, if we're walking with them in their struggle and building power through solidarity, I think that's really the only way to realize human rights on the ground. And we should call those child workers enslaved children.
Thank you. I'll briefly give the floor before we conclude and wrap up to Maher Nasser.
Thank you, Amar. I'm really glad that I stayed. I had to change something to stay, and I'm very impressed by the quality of the discussion. Of course, all the input from the esteemed professors, but also the students. I think you have all touched on something that we often keep in the back of our mind. And I think when you talk about human rights, it is human. There's human at the end of it. But when we talk about, I think, Jackie, you mentioned, you look at the environment and climate change could be seen in the prism of equality. But I think there's also a new discourse talking about the environment and other living creatures having rights. When we talk about, there's a new definition about, is GDP the only model that we can judge economic growth? What about the environmental damage or damage to the environment that we're doing to just grow? And for that, one of the SDGs, actually, it wasn't mentioned, is SDG 12, which talks about the responsible production and consumption. This is why we are where we are, because it's all about growth, money. And inequality and decolonization, it's not just within communities. It is definitely has written between, when you read statistics that the 6 wealthiest men, and they're all men, their wealth is equal to the wealth of half of humanity, that in 1 year, the value that they gained in their wealth equals the value of the entire 70% of humanity. That, and our Secretary General uses this again, that's one of the 5 chapters in the Summit of the Future looks at sustainable development and financing for development. And it is interesting to note that decolonization may have ended, but in reality, we still live in an intellectually colonized world. In the same way, when somebody in New York goes to get or somewhere else in the US goes to get a loan from the bank, and we know that banks have zoning areas, and according to where you live from, that your rate is going to be up or down. If you're applying for a loan from international institutions or private banks, global, and you're from Africa, the interest that you will be charged is 8 times of what it would be if you are a country from Europe. This is why half of humanity, the governments are paying more in debt interest payments than they are able to invest in education and health. And we talk about why are the SDGs stalling. So these are some of the reality of what we are facing. Does that give us, pessimist view? It should, but it shouldn't. I think we have to fight to ensure that we bring back the rights and a rights-based approach and insist on the principles that, again, transcend changing perceptions of expediency. And I think your passion, your energy, and I think that's what we are looking for. That's why there's also a chapter about youth and future generations. So I think I'm very happy to have stayed. I think this is the kind of thing that we will want to do more of. And the fact that there were 11 universities here who spoke is also testament to the great work to Omar and colleagues in the UN Academic Impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Maher, and to all the panelists, and of course to the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights of the UN for your participation. And let me conclude by saying, once again, thank you on behalf of the UN Academic Impact to all the speakers, but also to those who were in the room and around the world watching via the UN Web TV. And let us remember, not only this week, but every day of our lives, human rights belongs to all of us. Let's remember those who at this particular point in time are suffering because they are defending human rights, because they are promoting human rights. And let us also remember those who are suffering, fleeing from persecution, from violence, those who do not have any socioeconomic rights guarantee whatsoever. Let us think about them, but let's also think about the prospects of our own individual and collective and even shared responsibility towards human rights. We all have to do our work to make human rights and the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights a reality for all of us. And I thank you.